All right, as you just heard, we are going to be recording this session. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our second session of the Learning Community Preventing Substance Use Disorders Among Military Youth. We're really thrilled to have you all here with us today to hear about SAMHSA's Talk They Hear You program and the resources that they have for military families. I'm Angela Wright. I'm a senior project associate at SAMHSA's Service Members, Veterans, and Their Families Technical Assistance Center, and I will serve as your session moderator today. Just a brief disclaimer before we get started. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of SAMHSA or HHS. So our agenda for today, if you were unable to attend our first learning community, this is the outline of how we conduct each of them. So we're going to have a welcome at the beginning. We'll have introductions, we'll have a brief overview, but we're going to divide our presentation into two parts. And so we're going to have a little bit of presentation time, and then we're going to do some questions and answers where you get to ask our presenter whatever comes to mind, and then we'll have a facilitated discussion. So we want to hear from you during this session. Then we'll have a second part of our presentation, followed again by another opportunity for questions and answers, and then an additional facilitated discussion. So this session is designed to help us connect, learn from each other, and to make sure that we have an opportunity to come off of mute, ask your questions, and have a good discussion time. All right. With that, I'd like to make sure that we set a nice, safe and inclusive environment for our meeting together today. So if you could, if you have your microphone on, which I think some folks may, if you could please make sure that's muted, that would be helpful. Let me just see if I can help with that. And then also, if you could set your name, how you'd like to be called during this virtual meeting, that would be so helpful in our discussions. Please make sure you disable any AI transcription or recording services and use instead Zoom's live transcription setting. This just helps ensure that we have privacy and a safe space for sharing. Make sure your video is turned on during discussions if you're able. If you're not, that's okay. We certainly understand. And then throughout this call, we're going to use the raise your hand feature or the chat function to communicate with the group. And I'll monitor both of those things. Okay, so our objectives for the learning community today, we want to take a look at how we can prevent underage drinking and other substance use among military youth in particular. We have a number of resources to share on today's call geared towards parents and caregivers, community partners and educators. And we also want to identify opportunities that we can empower the voices of military and affiliated youth. So with that, I'd love to take a moment to have all of you introduce yourself in the chat. Please share your name, your agency, and which state, territory, or tribe you're joining us from. Okay. While you're introducing yourself in the chat, I'm going to turn things over to Stacy Owen. She's the Military and Veteran Affairs Liaison for SAMHSA. Stacy?
Thanks so much, Angela. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this call on services for military-connected youth and preventing substance use disorder. If you don't know, April is the month of the military child, so it's a really great time to really think about the 1.6 million kids who are serving alongside their parents in our armed forces and really celebrate them, and also take a look at the unique challenges that they face and how we as community partners can support them. We are really excited to have Dr. Rob Vincent here from SAMHSA Center for Substance Abuse Prevention. They have a great resource in Talk They Hear You, and it's always really validating when we can reach out to partners in other areas of SAMHSA that are touching the space of military and veteran community as well. So we appreciate you, Rob, for your great work over in CSAP. Thank you for lending your subject matter expertise to us today. And for all of those who are here attending, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to learn more about this important topic. Back over to you, Angela.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Okay, just to get us warmed up today, we're going to have a poll question and we want to hear from you. How familiar are you with Talk They Hear You? Very familiar, somewhat familiar, or not familiar? This will help give Rob an idea of how much you know. Maybe about 10 more seconds to answer this question. You may be in the middle of typing in the chat. All right, so it looks like we've got a few of you who are very familiar, but most either somewhat familiar or not familiar at all. So lot to learn today and a lot of resources to share. All right, so with that, I'd love to introduce to you our presenter today. Thank you so much for joining us. Rob Vincent, he is the Associate Administrator for Alcohol Prevention and Treatment Policy out of the Center for Substance Abuse Prevention at SAMHSA. So we're really thrilled to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will turn things over to you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Angela and team. And let me first say thank you for all of our veterans that are in the audience today and all of those that support our veterans. As a former vet myself, this is a part that of my life that is very memorable. And so anything that we can do to support service members, veterans, and their families, in particular our young ones, as anybody who has a dependent child overseas or in CONUS knows how that goes. And it's a lot of movement and a lot of transition for young people. So it's important that we do everything we can to support them. And Angela, to your point, sometimes people don't think, but our children are serving alongside us anytime we're doing this, whether you're a sailor, which was my case, and I spent 10 years literally at sea. So if you've had that experience, then you know what that looks like, trying to come in and out of family and do all of that. So it's always quite a challenge. So some things that I have today that I hope you'll find useful and interesting is our national campaign, Talk They Hear You. And you can go ahead and move to the next slide. So let me just give you a little bit of an overview and kind of set the table a little bit for our conversation. You know, I want to talk a little bit about our collective responsibility because that really is, and especially in the military family, I think this is an understood fact in military families that it is a family, and whatever branch of service that you're in, I think we often all operate that way. But it is a collective responsibility both within the community and the society we live in, and sometimes people don't always understand that aspect. But then I want to talk a little bit about some things that we can think about in terms of finding our way forward. And that's my term for the kinds of things that we can do that might have impact, but will also give you a little bit of information around the system we're in and the available resources, or in some cases, lack thereof. Why it's important for us to focus on adolescents. Um, why is that important? Why aren't they just little adults and, you know, they'll grow out of this phase? And sort of provide a little backdrop for some of that. And then I shouldn't say lastly, but primarily, I want to really give you a little bit of a deep dive in the national campaign and how we've aligned our public health messaging with interventions. And we've aligned them for interventions to prevent initiation, prevent progression and of substance use disorders, and then to prevent and reduce harms associated with substance use. And that's important. And sometimes we don't always talk about the reduce harms as much, but it's really pretty important. And of course, we'll break for some questions and discussion, then we'll go into part two, and then we'll sort of do a little bit of a demo of some of the resources and then answer questions from there. So if we can go to the next slide. So let's think a little bit about what the landscape is today. You know, it's important to kind of understand what's really happening. Alcohol-related deaths in the United States today are at 178,000 people a year. And this is data from CDC's ARDI data, which is the alcohol-related disease impact study that they do every year. And so you can see between 20 and 21 that we lost 178,000 people. Now, you might also realize or be aware that, we've had this little thing we've called an opioid crisis. This number is actually larger than that exists within the opioid crisis. And not to compare them, there are different things at play here for different reasons. But that specifically, as we talk about alcohol today, I'll lean in on that. And that's in part why the campaign is developed the way it is. If we can go to the next slide. So I want you to think about prevention as the front door to engaging parents and caregivers, educators, communities. Think about your installation, your command, your community within the environment if you live on base or as a part of a community on base. And think about, the kinds of things that might be available. And, one of my former jobs when I was in the U.S. Navy, I served on 4 aircraft carriers, so I won't give you names, but they're all the big ones. Was to have systems that were there to really help. And I want you to think, largely we would talk about the implementation of how we do science-based, evidence-based policies, programs, or practices. And that's kind of important as we think about the system. And so I would invite each of you, as you're working in those communities and providing services and thinking about that, to really think about it in that frame. And largely because we're looking at how we might impact health, wellness, and well-being, how we can promote that for our youth so that they're making different decisions rather than defaulting to, let's go behind the PX and, get some cheap wine or whatever might be percolating in your community at the time. But also to think about this thing that we often refer to as a continuum of care. And on the prevention spectrum, that's really the universal selected and indicated. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go further. But what's really important about all of this work is the fact that if we act early in the risk trajectory and across the lifespan, we can really disrupt uh, and work upstream to serve different age groups in a more coherent way. The science and the research is very clear about one thing. The earlier we intervene, primarily before the age of 15, the more likely we are to prevent and reduce a substance use disorder. And in fact, the research is very clear on that we can actually take 27 years of reduction off that the substance use career. Now, I want you to think about that. So in most cases, when we think about individuals as they start to have elevated risk and develop a substance use disorder, on average, it's 2 to 3 decades in that process. So think about what that means to advancement, what that means to educational attainment for a young person. Will they get a chance to go into college? What if you're a young person that wants to follow in mom and dad's footsteps and join the military yourself? Will you screen yourself out as a result of an infraction somewhere that causes you grief? All of these things really uh, lend itself to where you might end up at the end of that, including, and I gently say, including death. And for many young people, especially with fentanyl and some of the other substances that are percolating these days, it's a little bit more like roulette. You just don't really know what's going to happen. We know when we're working across the systems and really working to link mental health promotion and substance use disorder prevention, as well as the early intervention systems together, and the more closely we work, that we can really have a greater impact this way. Sometimes, and I'll talk about a tool that's available to you today, sometimes we don't often think about screening, identification, and referral. And that could be referral for preventative services, should you have them, or that could be referral for early intervention and or therapeutic services. It's important, especially with youth, to have warm handoffs. To drop them off at the office and expect them to have a conversation with a therapist or an interventionist or somebody in that nature, another adult that's probably not mom or dad, is probably not usually going to go well. So if you're a person working in a school, DoD school or something else, and you have something like student assistance services, this is where it's really important. And many schools in the United States today, whether on base or off base, do in fact either have school-based mental health, student assistance programs, or a school-based health center. And almost all, but not all, have nurses, and sometimes nurses in some schools will fulfill these roles. It's also important to think about the kind of resources that you provide around parent awareness and training kinds of activities. Most parents tell us that they really don't know how to have these conversations, that it feels awkward. Um, and so one of the things that we've done with the campaign is really lean into that idea on how we can help them not have the one big talk, but maybe more like 61-minute conversations. Um, Other things that are important is how you raise community awareness, especially on the base. And usually MWR and other groups usually have things like this that you can work with and partner with. But bases and military communities can easily develop coalitions, much in the same way as we develop coalitions broadly in the United States to do this work. And in fact, there would be nothing to prevent a coalition on a military installation from applying for a DFC, which is called a Drug-Free Communities Grant. There would be nothing to prevent you from actually applying for any of those, or a STOP Act grant. So you might want to think about some of those kinds of things. More importantly, one of the things that I think is important is we just need to really increase the understanding and access to behavioral health services through really better organized resources. And that's one of the things that we've attempted to do in the campaign. You can go to the next slide, please. So in that same frame, there's a few sobering facts that I also think, and this is a recent release of what we've reinstated. It used to be called the Drug Abuse Warning Network, DAWN. It was down for a few years, but this is largely a public health surveillance system that monitors emerging trends and characteristics that are really related to substance use emergency department visits. So think about this as somebody who lands up in one of the EDs somewhere in the United States, a hospital somewhere as a result of either alcohol or other. But if you can look at the stats there, you can see a few things that are particularly concerning. In particular, that 8 out of 10 of these were alcohol related. And then 7 out of 10 were alcohol related for youth, a little bit more cannabis youth in the youth space. But you can see where it's intoxication or binge drinking is the more common. But when you look at the age group, you can see the highest age group, which actually tends to be our early career military people. And that was my primary job when I was in the Navy. Lots of 26 to 44 years olds. So that, that really speaks much more to the service member. But in many cases, that behavior has a direct correlation and effect with the youth, and of course creates sort of disharmony in the family and potentially loss of career in the military. So all of these things become pretty important as you think about that. So next slide, please. When we think about adolescence, in particular, that's a pretty critical period. And you can see the sort of ellipse there, the purple ellipse. And as much as anything, what I want you to take away is if you think about, and I think on this graph, our earliest is, I think it's 12 or 13, and then you can just watch it escalate up to young adult, up to around 20, 21. But you can see as it continues to climb into 25, et cetera. But there are a couple of things that I don't know that people necessarily are always aware of that I think are important to take into consideration. And while this is focused specifically on drugs, it's also true for alcohol. That during adolescence, there's really two things that are sort of converging here. One, drug and alcohol use increases over time, and the brain is especially vulnerable to that damage. This can cause cognitive deficits. Cannabis in particular is very problematic in that space, but alcohol has similar effects. But that damage can include, changes, both temporary and permanent, to either the molecular or cellular or the organizational level. So think about learning math and having a chronic cannabis habit. It's very difficult to recall the quadratic equation when you're high, but that damage can be permanent for those folks. It's also worth noting that the cannabis or marijuana that is available for youth today is not the same stuff that many of us might have grown up with. The potency is so much higher, and that depends on the route of administration. In some cases, they're vaping. In some cases, that's 80+% THC, and some of those vaping apparatuses that are being used. All of that can create really long-lasting brain changes that will change their whole life. And I'll give you a quick example of how that plays out. My wife and I owned retail stores for a number of years before while I was a school administrator, actually doing this work. And I had a young lady that worked for us who was a raver. And I don't know if you're familiar with the term rave, but this is usually associated with MDMA and ecstasy and drugs, recreational drugs that are often used at these large dances that would occur in Seattle in particular for our period. But by the time she was 21, she could no longer count change. And there's a term that's used clinically that's often referred to as a flat affect, which means your range of emotion. And literally, this young woman had no range of emotion by the time she was 21. For all intent and purposes, she was practically, well, I would argue she was unemployable, even though as a favor to a friend, we took her on. But think about what that does for somebody at 21 who now is just really entering their life at that point. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So it's also important in that same vein to understand that substance use disorders are adolescent early onset disorders with adult manifestations. All right. So what does that mean? Well, that means that you literally 2/3 of everybody that is involved, about 90% of them actually start using up under the age of 18. But generally, by the time they're 21, they're likely to reach full criteria for diagnosis. Now, the bright spot, 2/3 are likely to go into remission from substance use. That has been true in our system, which has been good. The problem is that it typically takes decades, upwards of 3 decades to get to that space, and some will never make it. Some will die or create such damage that the quality of life for themselves will be as such that it will be fairly miserable. In the meantime, people with a substance use disorder die at an average of 22.5 years earlier than those without a diagnosis. So think about the years lost as a result of just that behavior long term. All right, if I can have us go to the next slide. So we often talk about a continuum of care. I've relabeled this as a continuum of health, wellness, and well-being. The IOM would just simply call this a continuum of care. But I do that primarily because what we're learning through the science is so much of our basic health and our wellness, meaning substance use, mental health, family connectedness, or functioning, um, is really related to our well-being, those things that help us thrive, those things like community supports, economic success, social determinants of health, all of those kinds of things that help us as individuals really be quite successful. Things like, you know, having a decent job, being functional in those spaces. But also, if you're a person who's recovering or is in that space, having the appropriate community supports. Or if you're not a person recovering, just in general, as a young person, having the kinds of supports that help you grow, make good decisions. And I would often say, fail in safety, because so much about youthfulness is about a little overconfidence, trying to do something. And the job of every parent really is to help them learn naturally from natural and logical consequences in a way that doesn't allow them to be harmed in such a way that they get the message and they learn from it, but can continue to grow and go, oh, I see why that's not my best interest. At the bottom of that is some of the things that I talked earlier, and that's a lot of what Talk Day Here is going to be really focused on today. But we will talk about the promotion side and tools available for you in that space, as well as tools that are available to you for universal prevention strategies and selected and indicated as well. Next slide, please. So what is Talk Day Hear You? What is this campaign all about? So Talk Day here really is oriented towards three audiences: parents and caregivers, and this could be foster folks. I would often sometimes, people don't always think about this, but nannies, aunts, uncles, extended family, all of those other kinds of folks that might be a part of that. That's all part of the parent and caregiver. If you're a person that supports the caregiving of a child, that's you. The other focus is on schools and educators. How do we help our school systems maybe do a better job? And then how do we help our educators be more present, engaged and providing resources and supports that might help the child? New this year, we just rolled our community efforts out this year, and next year we'll be rolling out a much bigger offering, but also focusing on that broader community. Um, and sometimes we don't always think about that, but when you're on the base, military families, especially if you're on base housing, those kinds of things are certainly one community. But in the military world, we tend to cluster a little bit. So it's about creating that sense of community and safety for all. More importantly, we're really trying to help each of those audiences get informed. So each tool is about helping you learn about the harms and the kinds of things that you might need to be thinking about, that, including how to have those conversations, how to be prepared, how to develop skills, how to be prepared to have the conversation, and then lastly, to take action. And action can take the form of a lot of things. That could be anything from an intervention to having multiple conversations, to deploying a student assistance program in a school, or working as a community coalition leader to help schools be more proactive in this space, or taking a broader view of that, working within the community to go, there are some things that are happening in our communities that I think are affecting our youth, and that maybe we should rethink maybe the siting of that pub or bar, or different drinking patterns that are going on, access and sales, those kinds of things. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So as a campaign, our primary goals really are focused for the campaign to increase awareness of the prevalence and risk of underage drinking and other substances. As I'd said earlier, really equip parents, educators, communities with the knowledge and confidence to do this. And we have heard consistently by many folks over the years, where we're celebrating our 10th year of this campaign, that in many cases, many individuals are not feeling like they know enough, or they feel slightly guilty because they might be a child of the 60s or something along those lines. And I say 60s as if that's the only group, but 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you can kind of extend that out as you may see fit with that, but may have engaged in something and be feeling slightly awkward about having those conversations. And then lastly, increase the actions. And all of our tools, when we talk intervention, that's what all of that is really about, is creating interventions. So why don't we go to our next slide? And I think we are ready for questions at this point.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rob, for giving us an introduction to the work and the program, and lots more to come in the second part as well. And now's the time, if anybody has any questions, you want to raise your hand or come off of mute, you are welcome to. If you have a question you want to put in the chat, you can do that as well. Okay.
Don't be shy. I won't be embarrassed, I promise.
Yeah, let's go to the questions to the audience, so then they'll automatically think about questions for you next. Okay. So we wanted to pose a couple of questions, and just to get a little bit of conversation going. And of course, if you have a question for Rob, please feel free to chime in. But I'd like you to consider this, and feel free to come off of mute or enter anything that resonates with you in the chat. But have you held conversations about underage drinking in any of these roles? And what was that conversation like? So whether it's the role of a parent or caregiver, a school leader, in the education field, or as a part of a community provider role.
Apologies for all of that, folks. I forgot to turn my phone off.
We actually didn't hear it.
Oh,
At least I
good.
didn't.
Good.
Does anybody want to break the ice for us? All right, there's a question in the chat to get us started here. This information is still sinking in. One question I have is your comment about adolescents needing a warm handoff. What or how do you recommend is the best way to do this?
So one of the things that I think is pretty important, adolescents in and of themselves, and we've all heard the stories that, kids like to talk to kids. And while that's true, one of the things that I also know that's true in that conversation is that the information that is often shared by a friend is not always accurate. Especially, so I'll just use an example. Most kids, the perception of that, everybody smokes pot. And of course, when you actually look at the statistical data associated with that, it's rarely the case. It's usually 20 or less, upwards of 30% for the older groups in an area that is experiencing lots of challenges. But on average, it's 15 to 20% of the kids are actually harmfully engaged or engaged in that sense. So sometimes it's about trying to get good information, but really developing a relationship. And the way I often tell parents in particular to approach this. So, I wish and if you feel free and comfortable, you can just raise your hand if you're a parent, or give a thumbs up. How many of you have had this sex talk with your child? My general experience with that is, for most of us, it's a terribly uncomfortable moment. And we want to try to get it all in because we're feeling like this is that moment I need to do it. And it usually is a longer conversation than is probably otherwise warranted in most cases. But one thing tends to hold true. The parent is scared to death and the kid can't wait to get out of the room. It's awkward, it's uncomfortable. And so the way I often really suggest that you have these conversations are bite-sized chunks. I refer to it as instead of the 160-minute conversation, like we're going to sit down and be real serious and have this conversation, to do it in the context of everyday activities, to be present. So, hey, I see you're going out with your friends tonight. Everything good? Who are you going out with again? Do I know that person? Have I met the parent? Is there a chance, if you're worried about that there may be a chance that they could get themselves in a situation? Have you developed your relationship in such a way that you could develop a code word? Like, text me a code word if you need to be picked up. What I mostly care about is your safety. I want you to be safe and I want you to come back home tonight. And so many times, we've seen many children over the years who felt felt like they were embarrassed to say that, or didn't feel that they felt that they would be judged. And while I understand the behavior is not what you likely want for your child, what is more important is to have the conversation, meaning that it's an ongoing conversation. Because by closing the conversation down, and it's easy to do as a military parent, especially with all that's at risk when you're on base and impacts to you as a service member or service member impacts, etc. It's easy to overcompensate with all of that. And all that does is further the behavior to go underground. Um, Approachability really comes, I think, is the key to all of this. And that's a difficult thing because it's a balance between being the parent and being in an active role as a parent. And, we're not really our child's friends, although I have friends that think they're their child's friend. But it doesn't really necessarily always work out in that sense. So I would, encourage some caution in that approach. Other tools that we've developed and that I think are quite useful and maybe new for some of you, there's a technique called motivational interviewing. And I absolutely adore motivational interviewing. There's a technique called roll with resistance. And rolling with resistance really is that idea of not reacting to when it's a situation that scares you to death or you just want to take control over, but rather responding. And then developing skills around how to develop discrepancy to help the young person understand that they put themselves in a situation that may be not in their best interest. And coming at it from what's their goals, where do they want to be, and how is this helpful or hurtful to their success? Usually when I can personalize it as a young person or an individual, that it may take away from something I want to do, well, that gets important to me. If you're talking all the theoretical stuff like, this could hurt you, when you're an adult, most kids honestly are not thinking that far. They're thinking about 10 minutes ahead here, to be honest with you. Um, and so being present in it is much more important than trying to do the big, this could kill you later in life. And of course, if they're using marijuana, they probably know, listen, I smoked pot and it didn't kill me yesterday. So, it's probably not going to kill me today. And of course, that may or may not be true as a result of accidents or others. But it is important to think about that. And you'll see in our materials where we're building that out. In particular, our Parents Night Out product, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes, and a couple of products that are under development, one of which is called Spark. Which is around strengthening parent awareness, communications, and rapport. But let me make sure there's not any other questions here before.
As you were talking, I had one question that popped up for me, and I was curious because you had kind of made the analogy of having the sex talk with children, and then we know that that should happen, as an ongoing thing from early on in life. How young would you recommend you would start having these kinds of conversations with children?
So in
Or your
particular,
children?
as it relates to substance use, we actually advocate as early as 9. Now, I want you to think about that. The way you're going to talk to a 9-year-old is certainly very different than you're going to talk to your 17-year-old son or daughter, for a variety of reasons. So it's really a matter of socializing in a way that's age appropriate. So, we've probably all seen the yuck sticker that, we often put under, like, for chemicals under our cabinets and those kinds of things. It's on the same order of thinking about it that way, right? It's like, so what are the kinds of things that aren't helpful to you or that are dangerous for you as a child? And helping them understand, more importantly, helping them start to understand and navigate the world they're living. Because if you're on this planet, it's and living in the United States, but it's true in other countries. It's very likely you're going to see adults drinking things. You may or may not understand what they're drinking and why their behavior changed later. Um, but it is important to talk about those in ways that are age appropriate. And excuse me, and that doesn't mean hitting it head off, but in the frame of cannabis in particular, I gently say our young people are much smarter today and have so much more access to information than most of us probably on this call did, that they can find things easily. And if you were to Google CBD as an example of that, you would think it cures all. And if you were to see gummies, THC gummies, you would think, oh, well, that's candy. And not really realizing that you could easily create an overdose situation. So it really is about trying to find those age appropriate ways. Conversation gets, of course, quite a bit different as they get older, which is much more about what that behavior looks like and how that's either in their best interest or not in their best interest. I always anchor it in helping them align with their goals for success and how is this helping them. So I hope that answers your question. And it looks like we may have another one. I'm not sure.
Yeah, one more. We have time for one more question in the chat, and then if you have others, we'll save it for the next round of questions. But what is in there is what is your advice on having these conversations within communities where the rite of passage is very strong with underage drinking? Perception of harm is non-existent.
Yeah, so this is where you get your work cut out for you. There's a couple of tools that I will talk about that are tangentially related to the campaign. I do 2 things here for SAMHSA. One, I run the campaign, but 2, I also lead a team that writes a report to Congress, which is the latest synthesis of the literature and research as it relates to underage drinking, including 27 policies and those kinds of things. To put a fine point on it, Alcohol misuse in the United States is a $323 billion a year cost to this country. So you have to know anytime you're doing community work that that's a long process. And part of that is getting buy-in, but it's also doing, from a SAMHSA perspective, one of a couple of tools that we would recommend is what we refer to as our strategic prevention planning framework, which is really, if you're a military person, this is not something new for you. Strategic planning is not a new concept, especially for military people. You do it with routine. That said, the whole goal here is to develop your data. And it's very simple things where if you can work with the Master at Arms, if you're a Navy person, but the base, post police or Master at Arms for the Navy side of that could be your Command Master Chief or, your gunny. But data speaks volumes, and local data is really the way. While we'll provide lots of state data, high-level state data, and national data, the best data you get to change local behavior is the data that's related to that. One of the tools that is useful. So one is the theoretical frame of that. So like, why is it not good for you to drink as a young person? And when it, especially in the rite of passage, and it's I was in naval aviation, and some of you might remember tailhook and some of these other things that made notable moments in time. And all of that sort of rite of passage thinking becomes very problematic, and sometimes is pervasive in the military, depending on what branch and which group, and it kind of bubbles up and bubbles down depending on. Part of that is to be able to have those conversations. But what I do know for sure that's on every command is that there is a senior enlisted and usually an executive officer that has responsibility. And while it's important to have those conversations with your senior post leadership to talk about the harms and those things, and they all collect the data. Now, they may or may not share it. They may or may not want to share it, but it's quite a useful tool. Because then you can start to have the conversation around community norms. And the flip side of this is it really gets to force readiness. If either the family, meaning the child or the spouse, or the military member themselves is not ready, then what we have is a risk to our national security. And that's the one thing I can tell you that every base commander understands, is if they don't feel like their troops are ready to do whatever they're designed to do, that becomes a scary proposition for them. So most are pretty, we've got family service units and a number of things. They are considerably different today than certainly when I was in. That said, I think it's a good opportunity to bring those things up and why they're needed, especially when it relates to mental health today. We've been overseas for a very long time in those wars, and so a lot of our young people have really suffered greatly, as has their families. So hopefully that answers your question. And I'm always available for an email conversation or something else. So if there's a follow-on question later, you are always welcome to shoot it to me, and I'll be happy to answer it when I can.
Thank you. And thank you, Sarah, for your comment. We added a military identifier on our youth prevention survey and YR BS survey. So I appreciate you sharing that. I'll go ahead and have us move forward in the agenda, though, just in the mindfulness of time here. So
So here's some of the campaign products that we've developed. We've developed several that are really military oriented. Talking to your child about opioids. So here's a brochure that's going to give you facts to answer some of the questions that have actually been asked here. So this will give you some of that background information. We've also developed a PSA that's very specific to the military community. It's titled "We Do Hear You." The campaign to date, just so you have a sense, we're in the top 25 markets in the United States. Now, if you're a person that's doing support or overseas deployment, forces afloat, any of that kind of work, all of our materials are available to you. So, you can run them on the AAFES channels or any of those. We can give you broadcast quality versions of any of those tools to do that. We have several. And then, we've got things like talking to your kids about drugs, what we call our 5 conversation starters, that lean in, the 5 primary tips to do that. We've got some versions, and I'll apologize, we have limited translation. In the coming year, we're planning to get probably 80 to 90% of our materials translated. We just have not got that done yet because we've been so busy in development that we really didn't want to do all the translation until we were done with the development. But there's a couple of examples there. If you'd like to go to the next slide. We also have what, I call them the print PSAs, but they're postcards. These are things that you can put in PX locations, any MWR, any locations that are appropriate within your military installation or anywhere else. Frankly, you can, use them as cheat sheet cards, even with your child to have some of the questions. You'll also notice there's a QR code there, and I'll make sure and dwell here for a minute. If you have a phone and you want to get to them, you can just hold your phone up and download them right from that QR code. We have tens of thousands of these. They're all free to you. They're in the SAMHSA store. They were developed very specifically for the military community. We will probably start a new cycle of that. And I would extend this to my colleagues here at the Technical Assistance Center, but also to anybody who wants input into this. Every product we've made to date is because somebody asked us for it and gave us an idea. Oh, well, of course it's deactivated. That means somebody didn't do their job. I'll have that conversation at the end of this webinar, so my apologies. If we can go ahead and go to the next slide, that'd be great. And here's an example of our conversation goals. So oftentimes we'll talk about show that you disapprove of underage drinking and drug use. What this really means is having conversations, that you don't need to sort of be the heavy hand in it. That rarely works either. So you can overdo this idea. But absent of conversation is as good as saying, yes, that's okay to do. Not talking about it is a clear message to a child that, it's okay to do this. Nobody cares. So it's really important that you talk about it. How you talk about it is equally as important. So, probably the sort of drill sergeant approach is probably not going to work very well. Now, that said, I've known plenty of dependent children who had fathers and mothers who were Marines that responded quite well to that. You'll know best for your family. But I think it's important to take stock and to take note of the approach and certainly the temperament of your child. It's also important to show that where all of this really comes from is a place of love and care. That really what I want for you is what's in your best interest around health, wellness, and your success. I want you to graduate high school. I want you to get a good job. I want you to be healthy, especially children who are sports minded. This is actually a pretty easy lift, because I've listened to a lot of children as of late really talk about, real athletes don't use because they don't want to do anything that would take away from their performance. And that's always a nice approach with those that are athletically oriented or quite healthy, health conscious. Make sure that you're a good source of information. I know that's a pain. It's hard to keep up on everything. It's not like you're doing nothing or just one thing in life. And that's in part why we try to build these tools out that are available to you, including the mobile app, and I'll talk more about that later. But, to sort of help you get the background information that you feel like you can talk articulately about it. I think the most important thing to me personally is being present, or show that you're paying attention, that you're aware of changes, either body changes, mood, affect, attitude. That's usually the big one that shows up for an awful lot, or their availability, or I'll call it the sneaky behavior aspect. And sometimes, I know children are moody, especially when middle school, that teenage space can be quite a moody period depending on, but it's important to pay attention to that and just check in. Hovering is not always good, but there is a time and place for hovering as well. So, I hate to say that, but there is a time when, if you're particularly concerned about behavior, it's probably important to be more present. And then lastly, build your child's skills and strategies, like how to help them get an exit plan. How do I have a refusal skill? I'm I'm an athlete, a musician. I'm very focused on getting a scholarship, any of those items. How do I help give you a way out of that conversation, including codes and those kinds of things? So that's a little bit about that aspect for us. If we can go to the next slide. In that same vein, we've developed, and this gets to some of the questions that were tendered earlier, we've developed a series of discussion starters. One that walks through a parent and caregiver, takes a child in a sports game and talks about sort of the nature. We give you an example of a husband and wife team that aren't actually on the same page. And we do that quite intentionally because especially it's true for military families, but the reality is it's true for all relationships. Is not always are you on the same page in the parenting game sometimes. And it's important to be, but it's also important to talk that through as a couple in terms of how you're going to approach that and why you're going to approach it. And we literally modeled the behavior for you in this example. Now, in student assistance in schools, that discussion starter, this gets back to the community norms that somebody was talking about earlier, where there's a sort of rite to passage. Schools are a great place to start into that. This particular piece really leans into why it's important for schools to have resources, student assistance, school-based mental health, et cetera, or somebody that's a trusted adult that they could go to in that space. And really why all of the members and individuals in a school are equally as responsible for this part of the conversation. To be talking about participating and observing, because in a 5-period class, your first period, second period, you might be just fine, ducked off your third period, got intoxicated, stoned, whatever the case may be. And, nobody else noticed it, but the fourth period teacher was like, well, he's a little off today, but maybe he's just tired. And that may happen at different times. And so that's each teacher's seeing a slightly different part of that. So it's important to help get them on the same page so that they're paying attention. Now, for our folks that we were talking about, sort of the rite to passage and community side there, we've developed one that's called This Life for Us. It's focused entirely on community and all of the aspects of community and why each of their roles are equally as important in terms of helping shape community norms to support our children. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. Now, hopefully this QR code works. I'm almost tempted to grab my phone and make sure. I'll resist. One of the things you might remember this little phase that we all endured, COVID. One of the things that became clear for us during that period is we needed to be able to put the totality of the campaign in your pocket. So all of our materials and everything that we do in the campaign is available to you in your pocket. You can even develop your own skills. You can actually record yourself and practice the conversation. You heard me talk about sort of how to get informed. We provide you information on the background, tools that way. We're building out new tools every day to support that, digital images, videos, etc., on the platform so that you can just go right to it. Now, in the center of that screen, it's kind of hard to see here, but in the center of that screen, you're going to see what says, the panic button. It's Screen for Success. It's down on the second one. So Screen for Success is what I refer to as our panic button. We have built into this. Should it be at a place where I've had these conversations and you are now worried that, you know what, my son's a little bit beyond a conversation at this point, I'm downright worried. We've built in a screener that is a 60-item screener that focuses on health, wellness, and well-being, but also provides resources. When I say resources, I mean either preventative or therapeutic services near you by zip code. We've geocoded it to identify those things that would be near you. But we've also listed national resources as well, including some for community, some for schools, etc. We are working on a professional version of this. If you're an organization or you're wanting to work with your post or your school, we have an organizational version of this that you can actually formalize a screening process should you be concerned about a child. what we're looking for here, this tool, and I'll talk more about it. There's another slide specifically on it, but this tool is built into the mobile app very specifically to help you. It's in all three of the platforms, all the ones that you're familiar with. And really is our version of a digital guide, and then what I refer to as the panic button, which my team hates when I use that word, but I always tell them, if you're the parent or caregiver that is now extremely worried about this, it probably feels like a panic button at that moment. We can go to the next slide if we could. So one of the other things you can do, and this gets back to the conversation around how you can change sort of right to pass, or rights to pass, use and rights to pass aspects of this. So we offer a component piece of the campaign that's called Parents Night Out. But the reality is you could do this with any adult group. Parents Night Out really is either a 1-hour digital version of this. So if you're stuck with the sort of the Zoom COVID version, we ended up parsing it, getting it down to welterweight to accommodate that, because most of us can barely take an hour of Zoom. But it's primarily developed for 3 1-hour sessions that takes all the resources and the tools, walks through many of the same conversations we have just had here. And you're able to do that with a parent group, or frankly, you could do it with any group. There's all the PowerPoints, all the materials, a guide, all of the things that you might need. It's designed to be a companion with the discussion starters as well, the mobile app and the other tools. And again, there's a QR code. Hopefully they're working. I'd be interested in your feedback. If they're not, I need to get my team on it. So we do have a group that is hosting Parent Night Out nationally. ESD 113 in the Pacific Northwest is holding Parent Night Out nationally, virtual versions of that. So they've agreed to do that broadly. It's something that the Technical Assistance Center could do, or any of you could do as a technical assistance tool. It really is turnkey. We always encourage, some localized adaptation so that it fits your community or your audience better. But it is developed so that you could do all of that. All right, next slide, please. Because we're trying to, wherever you're at, we're trying to give you access points into information. And I would extend this to any of you if you're interested in coming on our podcast. Debbie Burnt is our host. I think we have about 17 or 18 episodes at this point. It ranges everything from authentic parent to parent conversation around, well, this is what I did, this is how it went, or didn't go so well. Maybe some things I might do differently in hindsight, combined with experts nationally. So we've parsed it with a combination of leading experts nationally to provide additional information for parents and caregivers or any of the audiences, combined with authentic parent voices. And you can see there, you can go, it's in all of the platforms that you might think about, Spotify, Buzzsprout, wherever you can get a podcast, we're in it. It's very good. I'm a little biased on all of this, but I must say I was the guy that said, really, podcast? I'm not so sure anybody's going to listen to that. I'm very surprised at its success and how much people are actually listening to it. So please feel free to join us in that. If you'd like, we can go to the next. So you heard me talk about Screen for Success. I'll try to make this brief for you. Phase 1, what we're referring to as the self-screening and referral management, is live. You can use that today. You can go to the SAMHSA website, Screen for Success, on the Talk to Hear You website, or you can go to screenforsuccess.org and use it directly. But that's already available to you, or you can use it through the mobile app. The organizational version will be soft launch May 31st, hard launch October 31st. We have 8 states nationally that are rolling it out as large systems, but it's a free tool, so virtually anybody can use this as a part of an organizational tool to help identify and look for elevated risk. This is not a diagnosis. This is really looking at elevated risk in a child and then providing resources, both nationally and local. In the professional version, it is set up very specifically for organizations or states who have curated their own list of referral networks or systems that you could also populate it with your own resources. So let's take a military base installation that has decided they wanted to do this. You could put very specific military resources that are available to you on within your command right inside the tool. Now, it's still going to give you the geocoding, which means other sources that are outside of all of that. We always want to give everybody an option, but it would also do sort of, I'll call it the preferred provider kind of aspect, which is getting you to the resources that you and your command or individuals have invested heavily in. All right, we can go to the next slide if we will. You heard me talk about this a little bit earlier. We do refer to it as a multi-dimensional screening tool. That's quite intentional to focus on, and these are the elements that we're looking at: physical health, physical discomfort, chronic conditions. We've got questions on there related to that. Wellness, including measures for psychosis and suicidal ideation, and some iconology that comes out in the self-report. So there's a report that's generated once you finish the screener. The screener also allows you, because sometimes the relationship between a parent and a child on the self-screening referral management side is as such that maybe it's difficult for you to have that conversation to do that work with your child. You could literally send them a link and they could complete the screener themselves. Our recommendation is that you actually do the screener with your child. It serves as a point of conversation around what's going on, where you could answer these questions. Now, and I know what you're thinking, oh boy, I don't know if my child's going to do that. And you might be surprised. What we're trying to do is give you options as an individual that best suit your approach and utility for you to solve your problem. And that really is the function of the self-screening and referral management system. The professional side of this equation really is about having an organized way to do that as a resource. And we can go ahead and move on to the next. So here's some of the companions, as we talked about earlier. One of the things that's happening in all of that is that we're developing what we're calling SBIRs. So many of you may have heard of SBIRT, which is very focused on the treatment side of that equation. We're developing a version of this that's really primarily prevention focused, but also makes an accommodation for therapeutic intervention or treatment. And we can go to the next slide, and that should come up there for you as a part of our future products. So you heard me talk about Spark. That's what's going to be there on the green side. This will be the resources and tools that will go to build out Spark. On the SBIRS side, so we're starting with this as a school-centric piece, but the reality is you can use it in any environment. If you're working with youth, it'll be designed to help you work with youth. But it is really designed around screening and early identification to get there early in the conversation, have an organized way to do it. It's a 3-order intervention process. The first line intervention is around using motivational interviewing and motivational enhancement therapy techniques to have a conversation. Dr. Ashley Shadow, leading national NIH researcher, is building this out for us beginning May 1. The second line of that really is around cognitive behavioral therapy, but I would argue that this really is on the front. The CBT side of this is such a lightweight CBT. It's more educational than it is formal CBT. It is built off the motivational enhancement therapy, MET CBT5 frame, which is already an evidence-based practice, intentionally so. But the CBT sessions are pretty light. And then lastly is this sort of third tier of intervention, which is really, this is a child whose elevated risk really warrants, it's clear to us that you need to find services. And so this intervention is really about helping the individual who is doing that work with the family and the child to sort of case manage and to help do a warm handoff. This is back to our conversation around warm handoffs. This is a formal way to do that. We'll take some of these same elements and apply them to Spark and some of these other things once these are fully built out. But that's coming. We anticipate having that for school year 2025. So we're building it over this summer, and we should be rolling it out for pilot testing and use in that period. And if there are folks within your region that would like to participate in the testing and give us a very clear military view of that, and any adaptations we can make there, as I said earlier, everything we've built is because somebody asked us to do something. So we're happy to make those modifications. Let me try to wrap us up here. I think we're running short on time, so let me keep us moving. We develop social media. If you sign up for our monthly newsletter, we're going to send you every month a whole package of pre-developed social media tools that you can use to your heart's content in whatever environment that you like. And these are just a smattering of the latest round that we've developed. We're in all the usual platforms. You can look forward, I think in the next month, we will have our Facebook group active, which will be a place for people to come join, develop tools, offer up suggestions, get mutual support, and to do those kinds of things. So it's our way of providing, I'm going to call it community support, because sometimes the best conversations you have is if we're both implementing the campaign and you're doing something that looks particularly unique and I like it and I'd like to know how you did that in your community so I could do it, the best conversation you're going to get is directly with that person. And so we're trying to create that environment that allows you to work with other folks that are doing things to go, oh, I saw you did that. That's pretty cool. I'd like to do that. How'd you do that? And then give you guys an opportunity to engage with each other. All right. Let me go ahead and do the last slide here. I think we've got that slide and 2 slides left. How you can engage with us. You can see all the usual suspect ways. I talked about signing up for the monthly newsletter or bi-monthly newsletter. I think we're weighing out, do we keep going monthly or bi-monthly? I think we're at the place where we're looking at bi-monthly at this point. And then connect with other community leaders. That's in part why we're trying to create this sort of community piece. And then lastly, you can go to the last slide. And this will be, you can, hopefully this QR code works because you can subscribe right there and get subscribe to the newsletter and get right on the list. And we'll send you stuff every month with routine. And there's an entire team that just works on just that aspect. So with that, I'll pause and we'll answer any questions. And let me just say thank you for the invitation, and anything I can do to support you at any time, feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, Rob. So many great resources. It's a lot, and I think that it's just incredible what you've all put together. So there was, okay, somebody's asking me to go back a slide. You want the one with the QR code? Is that what we're looking for? This one?
Newsletter?
Let me know, Michael. I can move the slides. One question that came up in the chat, just off the bat, is about print resources. So is there a link to order print resources or
Just go to
brochures?
samhsa.gov to the store. If you go to the SAMHSA .gov, that will get you to the store. And let me just go there and I'll drop it in the chat for you.
Okay.
Because it's always easier, to be honest with you. I hate making people fish for these things. It's such a difficult thing. So I'll put 2 links in there. See, let's go to samhsa.gov. All right. On the samhsa.gov site, it will be in our publications. There we go, publications.
Rob, I actually just dropped it in there.
Oh, thank you. You're faster than me. My government computer is really slow these days.
No problem. I'm not trying to talk and type at the same time like you are. So
but there is a ton of tools. We have more than 500 products that you can use and download in all types and varieties, including custom stuff. So example for the people who are talking about community stuff, my team will do custom billboards, sizing for you. We won't pay for the billboard, but we'll pay for the digital sizing so that you can put it up. So you could probably get your MWR to put something up like this. We will do custom sizes for bus stops, all the digital renderings. I have a complete team that will do that for folks. So all you have to do is sign up. It is important to note, and I probably should have said this in the beginning, it is a trademark campaign. It is trademarked only to protect you, to be perfectly honest, because what we want you to do is to know what is being given to you is evaluated, researched, incredible, and consistent. So that is the reason that everything, while it's trademarked, that is true, it's all free to you. You can, when you sign up, they'll give you a license. All you got to do is sign up. They're going to issue you a license right away, just as a matter of that, to implement the campaign.
Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing that link. If there's any other questions, please feel free to come on mute or enter it in the chat. We had a couple of, we have a little bit of time, so we wanted to just use this time as an opportunity to hear from you all on what resources you recommend for underage drinking and other drug use. And another kind of like thought question is, what type of resources do you wish there were for underage drinking and other drug use among military youth? So I'd love to hear from the group on this. I'll give you a moment to think about it. You can either enter it in the chat or feel free to come off of mute. Okay. All right. So if you have anything you'd like to share, I see there's some stuff in the chat. So you wish there were more printed materials as a nonprofit. You can afford to print stuff. We see thousands of folks at festivals all summer long in May. Okay. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
So to that effect, we have hundreds of thousands of materials that all you have to do is order, and they will send you as much as you like.
Right. Well, why don't we go ahead and if there's anything else. Oh, I see a question in the chat I missed. I'm so sorry. I was just double checking. Karen had mentioned something, Rob, in the chat. She said, you mentioned community anti-drug coalitions. How do you see these organizations engaging with military groups and families?
To be honest with you, I would argue that I think you should develop your own. And, you can join forces with CADCA. You can use them and their institute to do that. But if you think about what a coalition is really a group of concerned individuals at the community level. Now, that said, I would tell you that CADCA's developed and perfected really a great way to do that. So I think it's oftentimes quite helpful to have, somebody who's done it before you. But that said, the reality is that a community coalition is that group of everyday people that represent the community and the installation from a number of sectors. Usually there are about 12 sectors that we encourage: business, community leaders, policymakers, parents, teachers, faith community, if so appropriate. There's a number of folks that, are usually important to have in those conversations because they touch the lives of all of us in so many different ways. But to be perfectly candid, when I was a CAC director for Nimitz, and we basically had our own coalition, and I worked with the family services unit to really bring parents and caregivers and community folks from our Nimitz community. So working with the ombudsman and those folks, really to have these conversations so that one of the chief jobs was, when we're going on deployment and coming back, the transition is usually traumatic for folks. So it's important to, to help develop some skills and considerations there. But if you're the parent, the spouse that stays behind and is doing all the parenting and everything else for that matter, it's a tall order. And so those groups need a lot of support as well. And I would just say the spouses community was always great for me, even when I was deployed, because I could often continue that work electronically or, snail mail, all of the rest. But I used to send a routine monthly newsletter and then communicate via ship communications, honestly, with our ombudsman to help prepare and get resources or communicate back and forth in this space, especially when I hate to say it, but when a child acts out or there's a kind of a critical incident. Sometimes it's helpful to soften those things. So sometimes you can do that. Now, I say that as if there's a one size fits all. That's never true. Actually, I think the word is one size fits no one. That said, there's a number of ways, and I really encourage you to think about using all those resources. Lots of people don't always use all of them or are reluctant to use them because of all of the concerns, because things can go depending on the individual. It can get, career threatening or, concerning, et cetera, et cetera. And I understand all of that. But I also understand that bad news doesn't get better with age. That, sometimes it's better to try to meet it head on. And to do that, it usually tends to be more effective, has been my experience. So I would encourage you to, use CADCA resources, but there are lots of coalitions. And a coalition is self-defined. So define it for yourself. I think the military community has done that pretty well over the years in different ways. You just have to have somebody and a group of people that are interested and want to do that. And that usually requires a leader of some type.
Thank you, Rob. Another comment in the chat and question from Erica. I live in a military town, and once the adolescent reaches high school age, they then go to a local high school after attending base schooling before then. Do you have any recommendations for this transition with more exposure to alcohol and other substances?
I do. My general rule, and mind you, when I left the U.S. Navy, I became a K-12 administrator running behavioral health programs in schools. That's literally what I did after I left the Navy. I would encourage you as a parent. What is a fascinating statistic for me is how few adults and parents within a community have actually been inside a schoolhouse since they attended school. And I understand for many of us, myself included, high school may or may not have been your favorite moment or fondest memory. That said, my encouragement is to go to that school and talk about it quite openly, and to see what kind of resources they have, and to work with either the guidance counselor. Now, it's important to note, guidance counselors are typically focused on academic guidance. Very few are actually therapeutically trained. There are some. I've known plenty over the years, but that's the rare as opposed to the norm. But they can give you access to good resources and help you think about the master schedule and how you craft that for a young person, especially if I mean, I hate to say it quite this way. Some children require more sleep as they're growing up. So like having a 0 period is probably not in their best interest. And sometimes there's a tendency to go, I don't know, he's 16, it's time for him to figure it out. Well, I understand that thinking, but I also understand that it's not always as helpful as you might assume, and the failure rate of that is pretty high in many cases. So I would encourage you to really knock at the front door and either work with the vice principal. Vice principals are usually the people on campus that do discipline. That's why I always recommend everybody develop a relationship with your VP. I spent a period in that role in my life. And because when there's a challenge or an issue, it's better that that person know who you are and know how to get a hold of you and communicate with you, because you can, rather than turning into an immediate suspension, which is not helpful for a young person, you can reframe that in a different way. Which, in many cases you can make accommodation. Now, I wish all VPs and schools were as accommodating as we might all hope for. I'm fully aware that not all schools are all that interested in all of that, and that's unfortunate. I would be very critical of that administration because I really think that your best partner is the parents. And sometimes they don't always think that way, which means you have to be assertive and say, listen, This is where my kid's coming, and I need to be present. What's available, and how might we approach this? And that could be a combination of sports. Sometimes they have after-school programs that are exceptional. The 21st Century After-School Program was great. Sometimes they're combined with YMCA's, Boys and Girls Clubs, other sort of community handoff. I shouldn't say handoff, it's not quite the appropriate word, but sometimes other community organizations. Some schools have been incredibly creative that way. You just have to find out if any of that's available to you. And if not, you can always work as a community organizer to help some of that happen. Bases, you'd be surprised. The way I ended up in school services was because my commanding officer said, listen, I want you to go out and work with the local high school. We heard that there were problems in the high school with some of our dependent families. You're my CAC director. I want you to go out there and engage with this school. It was Bremerton High School in Kitsap, in Bremerton, Washington, in Kitsap County. And that's actually how I got my start in the school career. Because when I got into it, I just adored it. And it made a big difference working with both the dependent military families as well as the community families. More importantly, what it really made a difference was, and we had military groups in the school. We actually had military support groups just for those dependent children when people were on deployment, so that they had a support group to talk about, I miss my mom, I miss my dad. They're over in Iraq, Iran, wherever they might be located. And that they're scared about that. And, that's a real thing for a child.
Thank you for that. One last question that we have time for today, Rob. I appreciate you sharing your experiences too. Are there evidence-based curriculums you recommend for K through 12 that would complement this approach? So this is going back to the coalition topic.
There are, you can use Gil Botman's life skills. That's a good one. Lee and Virginia's Strengthening Families 10 through 14 is a great little program. That's one that can be easily adapted for military families. It fits real nicely in that space. The MET-CBT5, our adaptation for SBIRTS is an MET-CBT5 adaptation, which already is an evidence base. Our screening tool is an evidence base in and of itself. It's got more than 1,000 publications against the screening tool. You can do other things. So there's a program that actually SAMHSA owns, but we're retooling it. It's called Communities That Care. Technically, that's the intellectual property of SAMHSA. But there's a number of other resources, our Strategic Prevention Planning Framework, which has its own evidence-based, and then there's some prevention resources on the store. It's called The Right Fit, but there's Tips for Teens, a number of other tools that way that are all very good. Second step, there's a Project Alert. There's quite a few EBPs for the school space. What is missing, in my view, is a whole school health curriculum that includes all of this. And a couple years back, we were attempting to actually put one of those together, but we lost the funding for it because it's a rather expensive endeavor to do that kind of curriculum. But we had lost the funding for it. That doesn't mean we're still not going to try it later, but we just, for the short term, we're on pause. But those are the things that just roll off on the top. You can also go, one of the places, it's the Washington State Institute for Public Policy. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Let me see if I can pull that up. They actually identify as a registry. What is it? WISP. IPP, I believe it is. Let's see. Yeah, WISP reports. They'll actually give you the cost effectiveness, the evidence around that as a tool. They're probably one of the best. Now, I am a little biased. I'm an old Washingtonian. I was a part of getting this thing developed early on and supporting it at the state level to get these things developed. So Steve Ayos and the team at WISP really went all out, but it came out of what's called a JLARC study, but a joint legislative session that actually mandated one of our universities to put this together as a resource for everybody in the state. There's another, Blueprints is another one. If you haven't heard of Blueprints, Carl Hill is a good friend of mine. He runs Blueprints. That's a very good one. That is a registry of evidence-based programs that are very good. Why is that not coming up? Blueprints, here we go, blueprints.com. So let me just make sure this is not actually like blueprints, like we're trying to do engineering. That's exactly what I just got. I'll have to find that one, send it to you guys. You can send it out, so don't waste your time. You can also go to our EBRC, the SAMHSA EBRC, and we have a new guide on alcohol in particular on that. That is useful for around the community building. It's a guide specifically on policy. I'll put that one in the link for you. And then one last other resource, and we've got a whole bunch of these that are in that frame that may or may not be useful to you. But we'll at least give it to you as a resource. The other one that I think I think is pretty useful for most folks, especially if you're trying to do some community organizing. This is where you can get, this is the federal portal for the reports to Congress, the latest research and synthesis on many of the things that I just talked about. And in fact, this whole campaign is governed by this group. The stopalcoholabuse.gov, that whole piece there, including a policy academy, the report to Congress, a number of resources. You can see all the member agencies. But there is a piece there, if you click on the report to Congress, that most people really are not aware of. If you want to know who and what's available in your state, if you click on the state and regional reports, so we break them out by the 10 regional reports, but if you click on any individual, find your state, click on that state, there's a PowerPoint on the data for your state that we collect and coalesce and put in PowerPoint form for you to use. This is back to how do I help break the norms in my community. But it also gives you the name of the person who heads up the behavioral health programs, all behavioral health programs in your state. It'll describe your statewide behavioral health system, who's in charge, what it does, how much money is there, how much they're spending on things. It'll give you an inordinate amount of what their priorities are, all of that kind of information. And that's largely because that comes from their block grant, which we pay for probably the preponderance of publicly available treatment and publicly available prevention is paid for largely by SAMHSA. And so all of those resources and names and contacts are all there for you, so that you don't have to go find them.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Rob. So many different resources to dive into, and really just appreciate the time that you've taken with us today. It's been great. So thank you so much, and thanks to everybody else for joining us. There's a few resources that we had talked about throughout the presentation that we encourage you to check out and dive into. And then just wanted to give you a heads up that our next session of this learning community is going to be with the SAFE Project and their SAFE Veterans Program. And that's going to take place on Thursday, May 16th from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So we hope you all join us for that. And we really appreciate all that you do for our service members, veterans, and their families. And we just have a wonderful day. So please don't hesitate to reach out to the TA Center. We will be sharing the slides and follow up to this session as well as the recording. So you'll have access to all of these things. So thanks again, Robert, and thanks to all who've joined. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Enjoy your day now. Bye-bye.